Hello and welcome back to this second video. For Year 11 revision, we're going to look at 4.1 and appeasement. We're going to try and recap it and give you some new information and deal with how to deal with the questions. Question 1, as we've already said, question 3 and question 4 is what we're concerned about today. We've got the fair comment question, which is worth 25 marks, and question 4, which is explain why not. Both of these may come up. You'll have a choice between the two, and we're going to deal with these a little bit later. We've got 6 historical controversies. It's known as historical controversy number 1, which is appeasement. The second historical controversy is the start of the Cold War and Cold War in general. Now, there's a number of different views, and you have to remember these by name. You have to rote learn them. So we've got the popular majority view, which is often known as well done, Mr. Chamberlain, very short-lived. We've got the popular and political view, which is often called the guilty men. We've got the appeasers, the misjudging of Hitler, interpretation 3, the Orthodox view or the Churchillian view. We've got rehabilitating Hitler, interpretation number 4, which is often known as the academic revisionist view. Then we've got interpretation 5, which is the counter-revisionist view, Chamberlain back on trial. So let's get stuck in. Historical controversy number 1, the popular majority view, well done Mr. Chamberlain, stems from the idea between 1937 and 1938. It was very short-lived. Chamberlain kept the war at bay for as long as he could. He gave peace a chance. Now, at the time in 1937-38, most people actually approved of what Chamberlain was doing. Opinion polls showed that he was doing the right thing, and he was treated as a hero. Evidence to support this approach in interpretation is he received 40,000 letters and a number of telegrams of support. His approach was supported by the USA. Britain was heavily haunted by World War One, my apologies. So there was a sort of euphoric reaction to what Chamberlain achieved in Munich and by delaying Hitler for as long as he did. So it kind of said that, you know, Hitler's the bad guy. They need to keep him at bay for as long as they possibly can to give peace a chance and allow them to rebuild their armed forces if necessary. Now, it had a big impact. It had some impact, sorry. It doesn't last long. The euphoria was short-lived. The British people felt guilty when France was defeated very quickly, and opinion polls generally show that they did not trust Hitler. There were critics at the time. They included the cartoonist David Lowe and Winston Churchill himself. Now, as the war progresses, the number of people that oppose this view increases. The second approach to appeasement in this historical interpretation is the guilty men. It lasts between 1939 and 1948. Now, this view has become widely accepted by historians, politicians, and the general public in the time, and it says that appeasement, the policy of giving in to Hitler, was foolish, cowardly, and immoral. And why did it happen? Well, that's because of World War II. You know, as we saw the losses being made and the difficulties that Britain was struggling to face, this view developed. Okay, who's the person that got us into this situation? And they're going to need to scapegoat someone. A short book was published in 1931 when The Guilty Men came out, and it targeted Adolf Hitler, and he was held as a scapegoat. Now we've got the people of Britain feeling ashamed of the Munich Agreement after the war broke out, and again this feeling strengthened as the war went badly. In the first few years we've got Dunkirk and other losses. Dunkirk was the retreat of the British expeditionary force in Europe. They needed somebody to blame. They blamed Chamberlain. Now at this point, it allowed Adolf Hitler to defeat. It allowed Winston Churchill to defeat Halifax. Halifax was calling for surrender to Germany, and Churchill wanted to continue. So it had a clear impact. It made appeasement into a dirty word, and it kind of shapes our future view of appeasement. So just to recap, we've got the initial view of appeasement, that it was necessary, it had to happen, it gave us a chance. As we've got the impact of World War II, and as things go bad, it changes our interpretation of appeasement, and we start to hold Chamberlain as accountable for causing the outbreak of war. It allowed the dictators, Mussolini, Adolf Hitler, the Japanese emperor, to grow, and it's seen as cowardly and immoral. Now, our third view is the Orthodox view, and it's a view that lasted from 48, at the end of the Second World War, all the way into the 60s. And the proponent was, after the publication of The Gathering Storm by Winston Churchill. Now, Winston Churchill loses the election in 1946, and he is bitter. He starts to write this book, and it's called The Gathering Storm, and it's a very, very long book, and you can still buy it today. And it is very critical of Neville Chamberlain. It calls him weak. It calls him miscalculated, that he misjudges Hitler. Now, why does this view come about? We've got the Churchill factor. He is known to be his own kind of self-promoter, and he comes out and says, history will be kind to me as I shall write the history. He's bitter at losing the election, so when we talk about the Orthodox view now, we can say that at the time he was bitter for losing the election. Initially, after World War II ends, we've also got the emergence of the Cold War. The two big superpowers, the USA and the USSR, the UK and its allies are now looking at somebody to stand up against, in a very similar position than they were in the 30s. This time, Churchill's the person calling the shots. He wants to stand up to the USSR right from the get-go. Now, when we assess it, the reality is that Churchill was not the only person to oppose appeasement in the 1930s, but his account has become the accepted view. There was no academic challenge in the 1940s and the 1950s, so it's heavily influential. Very few people challenged it, and it was even influencing presidents such as Harry Truman with the Truman Doctrine, and even in 1962 against Cuba. As late as 2003, Tony Blair has even asked us not to repeat the mistakes of appeasement. It's supported by a number of historians such as John Charmley, and it's a really standard view of appeasement, that appeasement was a mistake, a misjudgment, a miscalculation. Even if it had good motives to give us enough time to prepare to avoid war, we just made a mistake, a very grave mistake. Now, our next view is the academic revisionist view in the 60s and 90s, and that is saying that Chamberlain was in an impossible position and he did the best that he could possibly do. It takes until 1960s for any historian to really speak out against the orthodox Churchillian view, and that really changes as we start to get new documents and new information, and it's known in history as revisionism. A.J.P. Taylor in 1961 is the first historian to come out and argue that Hitler does not have a clear plan in the 1930s. He just seizes opportunity, and therefore Chamberlain had absolutely no way of knowing Hitler's intentions, and therefore no way of planning for it. So it's known as revisionism. It's supported by historians such as Donald Cameron Watt, who argues that Chamberlain is facing lots of different problems. The League of Nations, he has limited resources, and he has to do the best that he possibly can. He has to give Britain time. Where does this idea and this revision of history come for? We've got radical thinking in the 1960s. History is just one of those areas where people start to think differently. We've got the impact of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is going terribly bad. The USA's dislike of appeasement and turning to war as the first option has got them into this mess. It's going badly, and that influences historians' views. And of course, we've got British sources. In the 1950s and late 1950s, we've got the publication of the Public Records Act, which means we saw information that we had never ever seen before, and historians poured through it. Information from the Treasury, the Armed Forces, the Foreign Office, and we got to see this new information. There were new studies, new debates in the 70s and the 80s. So you can see how historians have started to challenge the views of the orthodox approach by Churchill, and that's heavily influenced by the decisions and the events that are happening at this time. Now, the fifth school of thought is Chamberlain back on trial. We've got counter-revisionism. So remember, we've got revisionism in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, and now we've got the counter-revisionists. This is another group of historians who look at the approach and say, actually, they're wrong and that this is right. And it questions whether Chamberlain really did actually have no choice. In 1993, Robert Parker develops his counter-revisionist approach. He says that it's not a full reversion to Chamberlain having no choice. It does still hold Chamberlain accountable. Chamberlain, though, is accused of overrating his own abilities. He doesn't understand Adolf Hitler. He ignores the advice of others, and he betrays Czechoslovakia. So it is still critical of Neville Chamberlain. Now, where does this change come from? It comes from the historical debate at the time. You know, an academic historian's job is to disagree with other people and to refine these ideas and interpretations. We've got new Russian sources, the end of the Cold War in 1989. That reveals USSR documents that we're able to pore over, and it gives us new approaches and insights into appeasement, especially Hitler and Chamberlain. You've got historians such as Paul Kennedy, you've got historians such as Andrew Stedman, Robert Parker, and Niall Ferguson. They all start to challenge these views, and they are academic historians. Now, it's not a dramatic impact as orthodox or revisionism, but it continues to stir up academic debate. It leads to an exploration of Chamberlain's options, and we start to see the emergence of counterfactual history. Now, this is using complex computer programs and other things to kind of second guess what ifs. So, for example, Niall Ferguson wants to explore a historical simulation to see about an alliance with France and the USSR and war, and you can read about the results of that later if you wish to. So those are our different events. So just to recap, we've got the initial popular majority view, we've got the popular and political view, we've got the revision with Churchill's orthodoxy, then we've got the academic revisionist approach, and then we've got the counter-revisionist approach. And this takes us from 1939 with the outbreak of war all the way through to the 1990s and the 2000s. And you've got to think about all of these major events happening and how they influence historians' views. Now, this comes together in a question. Question 3 is, do you think this interpretation is fair? Comment ... So it can be about the Cold War or appeasement. This is focusing purely on the evaluation of the interpretation. So you have to focus on, is this a good interpretation of the past? The 3 things that you must remember: you have to cough, C-O-F, context. When is the author writing? How does that influence his ideas? How does it affect what he's thinking about? If the author is writing in the 1960s, it's the height of the Cold War. If the author's writing in the 1980s, the late 1980s, it's the end of the Cold War. How is this going to alter his view of history? You've got to use other historians. You have to know the names, or at least the schools of thought, so that you can criticise and offer alternative views. And lastly, you must support it with your own knowledge. You've got to support or challenge the view that's given in the interpretation. Now, this is a very basic approach, but this is something that you can use. So you can use this writing frame as long as you are ticking each of these boxes. Am I talking about the context that the author's writing at the time? Am I talking about other historians? Am I talking about factual information around the outside? So the author is saying that. Summarise what he's saying. Give context. He's writing in the 1960s, this event's happening. He's writing in 1940, it's during World War II. Is it a fair comment? Yes, it is, because. But it isn't a fair comment, on the other hand, because. You have to support it with other historians. Now, question 4 is slightly different. It is focusing on knowledge of other interpretations rather than the strength of the interpretation given. Again, generally, you need to compare to other interpretations, explain why they are different. You have to talk about how the interpretations change over time, and you have to explain them. You are telling a story in this type of question. Why are not all historians the same? Because they are influenced by the events around them. For example, this is the kind of answer that you need to write. In this interpretation, it outlines this event. The first interpretations of appeasement were the initial views that Neville Chamberlain had no choice. This is different to the interpretation given because the initial interpretations was followed by a revision during World War II as it was influenced by the views, etc. They disagreed with this historian because this was replaced by, or this was followed by, the Orthodox view, then the Counter-Revisionist view, then the Revisionist view, then the Counter-Revisionist view. And you've got to be talking about those four things. Now I'm going to give you the option of looking at these two and answering them. So you've got question 3, question 4. Have a go at both of these for both of the questions. Now Louis Shaw in 1987, 2 years before the end of the Cold War, cough cough, says, to the dismay of the British colleagues and his French allies, Chamberlain alone, motivated by his anti-Bolshevik, anti-communist prejudice, deliberately sabotaged the chance of an Anglo-Soviet alliance in 1939. Such an alliance would have been a workable solution, discouraging or, if necessary, defeating Hitler. What's this source saying? It's blaming Chamberlain. It's saying that he and Daladier, he chose to sabotage any chance of a partnership with the USSR because they feared communism, and that scuppered any attempt at an alliance that would have been able to defeat Hitler. Who does it blame? Neville Chamberlain, to some extent, saying he's naive. So this is a revisionist view. Donald Cameron Watt in 1991 says the personality, remember this is after the Cold War's ended, the personality of Chamberlain is central to the discussion of appeasement. He had a rather inflated sense of his own judgment and abilities and was unwilling to listen to anyone but himself. It could be said that he saw himself acting in the name of God or history, and it earned him the disapproval of his people and historians. Again, another critical view of Neville Chamberlain. Why does it have this interpretation? So, have a practice at the questions. That has been 4.1 on appeasement. Thank you very much.